this is Amit with the Nginx video tutorial series. This series will consist of multiple videos. I will start with the installation and basics of Nginx and then move on to advanced configuration, optimization, and security in the following videos. Please stay tuned for my future videos. In today's video, I will start with the introduction, installation, and review of the default configuration, as well as configure a basic hosting with Nginx. Nginx has become one of the most popular web server, and it competes with Apache. It is a powerful web server and uses a non-threaded, event-driven architecture. It is not just a web server, it can also be used as a load balancer, a caching server, or a reverse proxy. Depending on your use case, you can use one or more of these features at the same time. There are three main ways to install Nginx on your server. 1, you can use your distributions repository. 2, you can use Nginx repository. And 3, you can compile it from the source. Out of all these three main ways to install, the fastest, simplest, and the easiest way to get Nginx installed on your server is to use your distributions repository. So let's go ahead and get the Nginx installed on this server. For this video tutorial, I'm using the CentOS 7.6. As you can see here, I will just go ahead and use the yum repository to install Nginx. That is basically it for the installation. It's pretty simple, straightforward, and easy. This is the default installation. Now the default yum installation puts all the configuration files in the etc Nginx directory. Let's take a look at that folder. So these are all the folders and files inside the etc Nginx directory. I will touch on the most important ones. The conf.d directory is a directory where you can put all your modular web host configuration file or the virtual host configuration files. The default .directory is supposed to have the configuration file for the default website. The fastczi.conf file is the configuration for the CZI stuff. The fastczi params, as the name suggests, has the parameters for the fastczi. The mime.types file has the definition for the mime types, and the nginx.conf is the main configuration file for the Nginx. Let's take a look at the Nginx configuration file. This is the default configuration created by the installation of Nginx. As you can see here, the top portion has the links to the documentation, and the configuration file starts with the user directive. The user directive specifies what user to run Nginx under. If we look at our etc passwd file, Nginx, grep for Nginx on the etc passwd file, we can see that the Nginx has created a new Nginx Web Server user. Let's get back to the configuration file. The worker underscore processes defines the number of worker processes that Nginx will use. Since Nginx is single-threaded, it should be set to the number of CPU cores, or you can just leave it to auto. The next directive, error log, defines the global error log file for the Nginx. So this is where all the Nginx error logs are stored by default. The next directive PID defines the PID file for the Nginx. The next is the include directive. It is used to include other files into the Nginx configuration file. This include statement is loading all the configuration files from the modules directory, the star.conf, anything ending with .conf. The next is the events block. In the events block, the worker connections directive defines the maximum number of simultaneous connections for each worker processes. The higher the number, the higher simultaneous users Nginx can serve. The next block is the HTTP block. The log format here defines the format of the access log. As we can see here, it's a log format, and this defines the name of the log format. You can define multiple log formats with different names, and then you can reference those in the server blocks to format access log differently for different websites. As we can see here, this is the access log directive that actually defines the access log and it is referencing this main is the log format. So basically this will create the Nginx access log at this location in this format defined here. Now, a couple of options here. The send file option enables use of send file, which allows transfer of data from a file descriptor directly into the kernel space, and that helps save a lot of resources in between. If you're serving static files that are stored locally to the web server, this option is very important to speed up the web server. If you are, however, using the server as a load balancer or as a reverse proxy, you can deactivate this option. The TCP no push option has to be activated if you are using the send file option. It optimizes the amount of data that is sent at once. The TCP no delay option forces the socket to send data in its buffer no matter what the packet size is. The next is the keep alive timeout, and that sets a timeout during which a keep alive client connection will stay open on the server side. Types has max size defines the maximum size of the types hash table. And we see yet another include block that is including the MIME type definitions from the mime.types file. The default _type directive declares the default MIME type to be application/octet stream. Onto the next directive here, it is including all the .conf files available in the conf.d directory. That is basically used to modularize or separate the configuration for each of the website that you are hosting. Now there's this server block. This is where you actually define configuration for a website. This block is the configuration for the default server. As you can see here, it listens on port 80, and this is a default server. The next statement is another listen statement that instructs Nginx to listen on IPv6 interface on port 80, and that's also a default server. The server underscore name directive is set to underscore. And then the root directive defines the document root for the website. The next include directive here is just loading the configuration file available inside the default.direct, which is basically the configuration for the default website. The location directive is used by the Nginx to identify which block to use to satisfy a request depending on what is being requested. The error page directives define the location of the error pages. There is also a commented section that has the settings for a TLS enabled server. We will skip the TLS enabled server for this video and we'll cover in the future videos of the series. That is it for the default configuration file installed by Nginx. Next, we will go ahead and create a minimalistic Nginx configuration. Let me just back up the original configuration file. Open up the Nginx configuration file. I'm going to delete everything here. And we will start with the minimalistic and fresh configuration. First, we will start with the user Nginx directive. We want the Nginx to run as user Nginx. Then we will have to declare the events block. Even if you don't have anything in the events block, you still have to specify the events block. Next is the HTTP block. This is where we will configure all the websites that we will be hosting. Here we can have server block to host website. You can have another server block here. And you can have furthermore server block here. So you can have as many server blocks as you like, or you can just go ahead and include. You can also do is include, let's see, nginx conf.d start.conf. You don't need the quotes here. So that's how you can include other configuration files from the conf.d directory or any other directory of your choice. For the server block you need a minimum of 3 directives. The first is the listen directive. This specifies what interface and port to listen on. You can just specify *:80, which instructs the Nginx to listen on all interfaces on port 80, or you can just say 80 and it'll still listen on all interfaces on port 80. Or you can specify 127001:80. That means it'll listen on just the loopback interface on port 80. Or you can specify the actual interface on which you want this server block to listen on. Right. We'll just leave it to 80 for now. The next directive you need is the server_name directive. This directive is used by Nginx to identify which server block to use to serve a particular request. Now the server name, we can just say test1.example.com. Then lastly, you have to specify the root or the document root for the website. So where do you want to serve the files from? Say var www.html/test1 for this example. Let's go ahead and configure yet another server. Could still listen on port 80. Server_name. Let's say this is test2.example.com. Then the root is going to be var www.html and test2. Let's get rid of this block. So this is a very basic and minimal Nginx configuration that'll serve 2 websites, test1.example.com and test2.example.com. Let's go ahead and check the syntax. So whenever you make any changes to the configuration file, make sure to test the syntax. That'll help you avoid any situation where you apply changes to the configuration that has syntax errors. You can do that by issuing nginx -t. We installed the Nginx, but we never started Nginx, so let's go ahead and start Nginx. And if we look at it, if we look at the listening ports, we can see that the Nginx is listening on TCP, which means IPv4 0.0.0:80, which means it's listening on all available interfaces on port 80. Now, if we go to the browser and put the IP address of this Nginx server on the browser, we can see that we get 404 not found. That is because we instructed the Nginx to serve files from this directory, but we don't have that directory on the file system. We haven't created that. So let's go ahead and create that. And also create an index.html. This is test1.example.com. Back to our browser, and we can see that we get the page for test1.example.com. We also have another website configured here, test2.example.com. Let's create an index file for that as well. This is test2. This is test2.example.com. Even though we have test1.example.com and test2.example.com configured on the Nginx, when we put the IP address in the browser, we still get test1.example.com. And that is because, let's go back to the configuration file. As we can see here, we declare that this website, for this server block, the server_name directive says test1.example.com. And for this server, it says test2.example.com. But in the browser, we asked for 192.168.100.107, which is the IP address of the Nginx server. So Nginx has no way to identify which server block to use to serve that request. And for that reason, it just served us the website that is configured first. Let's move this second block, server block, to the first place and then see what happens. So I'm going to paste that here, save it, and I'm going to reload changes to the Nginx. So in order to reload changes to Nginx, you can do systemctl reload Nginx, or you can do Nginx -s reload. So that'll reload the configuration. Now, if we reload the page, we can see that we now receive test2.example.com. So, like I said, whatever website you have configured first will be your default website if nothing matches the server name. Now, let's try to access these websites with the actual server name, test1 and test2.example.com. Since there is no DNS record on the internet that points to these servers for test1 and test2.example.com, we are going to have to override our etc host file to point those names to this IP address. So we can do that by modifying the etc host file. 192.168.100.107 is test1.example.com. 192.168.100.107 is test2.example.com. Save this file. If we go to test1.example.com now, we should get test1.example.com. Now if we do test2.example.com, we should get test2.example.com. Now it does not matter what the order of server blocks are, because now we are asking Nginx directly with the name of the server that we want to access. So whenever Nginx receives a request, it first looks at the listen block and then checks to make sure the IP address and the port of the request matches against the listen directive of each server block on the Nginx server, and builds a list of server blocks that may be used to serve the request. Then it looks at the server underscore name directive. Because Nginx can host multiple websites, therefore it needs to know which block to use for a particular request. Like we saw in our previous example, when we accessed with the IP address, it did not know what server block to serve. So it uses the server underscore name directive after matching the listen directive to figure out which website to serve. After matching the listen and the server name directive, if there is a location directive, then Nginx will look at the location block to identify which block to use to satisfy a request. So that's basically how Nginx works. Before concluding this video, I will talk about some of the management commands. So in order to restart Nginx, we would have to do systemctl restart Nginx. I'll restart Nginx. Systemctl reload Nginx will reload the configuration file to the Nginx. We already talked about Nginx -t, which is used to check the syntax for the Nginx configuration file. And then there's another option, Nginx -s. The Nginx -s is used to send signal to the running Nginx instance. You cannot use Nginx -s to the Nginx if it's not running, but when it is running, you can pass the Nginx -s reload option to reload the configuration. You can pass the reopen signal to reopen the log files. You can also pass the stop signal. What it does is it performs a fast shutdown. You can also send the quit signal, which does the graceful shutdown of the Nginx server. That's it to the first video of the series. We covered the basics of Nginx, the default configuration, and some of the commands that we can use to reload the changes restart Nginx, and send some signals. I hope this video is useful. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.